Hey game developers, and welcome back to the C# Fundamentals for Unity course. Now, in this one we're going to be talking about functions, but before we begin, I want you to check out the previous episode if you haven't seen it yet by clicking in the top right, or if you want to see the course from the beginning, click on the card in the top right now, and that will bring you to the beginning of the playlist. Okay, so if you're continuing on with me here, let's just go ahead and start with what a function really is. So I'll give you some basic applied definition and theoretical definition. So from an applied sense, a function is just a set of code or any number of code lines or lines of code that can be performed with just a call. Or in the theoretical sense, a function is a procedure. So basically it's doing a step, basically one to n steps, n being, of course, a variable number if you're unfamiliar with mathematics. So, okay, so why don't we just go ahead and start with looking at what a function is by showing you a header. So we can see actually in any C# code, the main function is really where the program starts. And so you may not have noticed it, but of course this main this thing called main is a function, and it does have a header here with a lot of different features on it. But to be more clear, I'm going to go ahead and write my own function that will let me kind of demonstrate really what it is. So why don't we go ahead and go down below our main function here, and I'm going to make a new function here. So I'm going to start by writing down the word public, and just follow along here. You don't have to worry about what all these keywords mean yet, but I will just be writing them down. So I'll write public void. So my function here, my function, I'll put a left parenthesis and a right parenthesis. If you're in Visual Studio, it'll autocomplete it by default. And I'll do the same with these curly braces, which state the beginning and end of the procedure, if you will, or rather the set of code. So my function right now is a perfectly valid written function, but it just doesn't do anything. It can be called, and I'll show you how to do that in just a moment. But first, I want to show you what all these different things in a function header are. So we see public here, which is an access modifier, which we will cover in the future. But basically, that just means where in the source code this can be accessed from. So in this case, since it's public, anything with the access to an instance of program, which is our class, can call my function from outside or inside. So the next part is void here, and void is the return type of a function. And what that means is when our function performs something, it can send back a value to where it was being called from. So for example, why don't we go ahead and make a second function here, and we'll call this one public. This will be an integer, right? And this will be called return 1. And so all this is going to do is we'll write return 1 here, and so that will literally just return 1. So let's first, before we call this function, go back to my function, and let's tell it to write a line. So we can tell it write line, and instead of number here, we can write in, I don't know, maybe a paragraph of sorts. Okay, so we'll say hello, and then we'll write another line here. So we'll say my name is, and I'll write my name in here. Okay, so as you can see, we have 3 lines of code, and this will, of course, amount to a procedure like we described. We call the function once, and then it does the rest, right? So I'll show you now how we call a function, which you probably know by now, and that's pretty much just what we're doing here. So readKey is a static function of the class console, and the same with writeLine here. And I'll just go ahead and prove that to you by first deleting our old code here, and I'll just call my function right here. And by the way, we will need to be making these static. And what that means is that rather than being an instance, basically, rather than having to need a reference to an instance of the class program, this way we can just call it from the class program. And if you don't understand what that means yet, don't worry about it. We will be covering that in the future when we cover classes and the concept of static and non-static. But for now, just know that these need to be labeled as static if we want to be calling them from a static function, right? So, all right, so now we can call my function, right? And this is the same thing as writing program.myfunction. But Visual Studio will darken this and say the name can be simplified because it is redundant to try to access a static function from the same class as we're already referencing it from. So I can delete this, but I just wanted to show that to make it clear. Okay, so we're calling my function here, and just like we do in all the other videos, I'm going to go ahead and hit start here, and we will see a console pop up here, and it just prints out these 3 lines. Totally simple. Nothing complex here. If you're thinking, well, this is too easy, you're really not missing anything. So we just see, hello, my name is Bilal. So I'll hit a key because our read key function here just makes it close after we hit a key. And yeah, so that's how you call a function, and that is what a function is and what its header means, and what we do when there's no return type. So what if we want a return type, right? So here we're returning an integer, right? So why don't we go ahead and just collect this integer? So I'll declare an int variable here. So int, I don't know, I'll just call it integer because why not? Equals return 1. Right? So what's going on here? So as we covered in our operators episode, you see this assignment operator assigning return 1's value to integer, which is interesting, right? Because return 1, we don't have a determined value of what it really is yet, because it's not a written variable or anything. It's going to perform the calculation on the fly. So what's going to happen in this statement is return 1 will be called, what's in here will be performed, it'll return 1, now the value is here, and then the assignment operator will say, okay, take the value of what's been computed here and put it inside of this integer variable. Okay, so now why don't we go ahead and print integer, right? Okay, so we'll use console.writeLine, that's how we print in C#, and we'll put in integer. Okay, and you can probably guess it'll now do this, it'll show all these words, and then it will print the number 1, right? If that makes sense, then you're on the right track. So why don't we go ahead and hit start, and now we just see the number 1 after our previous text. So that's what a return type is. You could also, use the assignment operator in any other way. Like I could literally, let's go ahead and close this. I could literally write 1 here, and the same thing would happen, right? So I'll hit F5 to pull up this again. And we see just 1 again because it's doing the same thing, but what's happening is that I'm calling a function. Now, if we really wanted to make this useful, then we could do some function where we add things, right? So why don't we go ahead and create a function that is a addition calculator. So let's do public static int for now because we're only using integers. Add 2 values, right? So, oh, actually, we'll call it get sum of 2 values. And the reason I say we'll write get sum of 2 values is because I feel like that's more clear. That it is returning the sum of these 2 values as we write the word get. So in just a second, you'll see why that kind of makes sense, right? So let's do an integer a and an integer b. Okay. So what we'll do here is we'll write return a plus b. Pretty simple, right? Plus operator, 2 variables. In this case, they're actually parameters. So why don't we go ahead and copy this over here. And why don't we go ahead and cover some quick terminology here. So over here, this would be considered the callee side of, the caller side of a function. And this would be considered the callee side of the function, right? So that means that this is the function being called. This is where it's being called. Okay, so why don't we go ahead and write in 2 integers. So we'll say 2 and 8, right? And yeah, so 2 plus 8 should be 10. So once integer is printed, and I'll go ahead and comment out my function here. So we should see just the number 10. And that's exactly what we see. And if you think about it, now you have a calculator's logic in terms of addition. And that was nice because now we can just toss 2 things inside of this function and it'll figure out the rest. And that's really great if we want to perform some sort of complex algorithm or calculation, or if we just want to do a lot of things, right? And that's kind of the I guess, motif, if you will, of the previous episode where we covered iterative statements. We were saying this concept of dry code, which means don't repeat yourself. It's an acronym, DRY. And that just means we want to simplify things by being able to use the same code in multiple different areas so that coding becomes easier both to read and to write. So if you can look at this, for example, we also not just get a plus from the simplicity of writing this, but we can also make this really easy to read in that we see get sum of two values, and then we'll write the two values here. So like an integer, this variable is going to now store the sum of two values, and that's pretty easy to read in terms of English. So that is actually everything I want to cover with functions, I think, right now. And yeah, I really hope this episode was clear. If it wasn't clear or I missed out on something, please leave me a comment. I want to make sure that these are clear. Otherwise, you can check out two things. First is a free ebook on how to make your first game in the top right, as well as a free sample video from a course on how to make your first game in the top right now. So definitely check those out if you want to make your first game. And with that said, I will see you in the next episode, and have a good day.